My name is Natalie Brooks, and I'm 28 years old, standing in my childhood kitchen covered head to toe in chocolate frosting. Just moments ago, my father hurled my homemade birthday cake across the room, screaming that nobody in this house cares about me and that I'm nothing but an ungrateful waste of space. The cake I spent 3 days preparing lies splattered against the wall, years of trying to earn his love destroyed in mere seconds. As he storms out, declaring me worthless, I stare at the chocolate mess dripping down the wallpaper, remembering every forgotten birthday from my childhood. But then I notice something glinting behind the decorative plant in the corner, something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt unappreciated by family, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe because what I discovered on those security cameras will absolutely shock you. Trust me, this story takes turns you won't see coming. Growing up in the Brooks household meant walking on eggshells every single day. My mother, the light of our family, passed away from cancer when I was just 12 years old. After her death, my father Richard transformed into a completely different person. The warm, loving man who used to read me bedtime stories and braid my hair became cold, distant, and impossible to please. I threw myself into becoming the perfect daughter, believing that if I just tried hard enough, I could bring back the father I remembered. I maintained straight A's throughout high school, played varsity soccer, volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, and participated in debate team, student council, and drama club. Each accomplishment felt like throwing stones into an endless well, hoping to hear some echo of approval that never came. When I brought home my acceptance letter to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship, I expected at least a smile, maybe even a hug. Instead, my father glanced at the letter for maybe 3 seconds before tossing it onto the kitchen counter. "College is expensive," he said flatly. "Hope you've figured out how to pay for the rest." That was it. No congratulations, no pride in his voice, nothing. I worked 3 part-time jobs throughout college, serving tables at a diner near campus, tutoring freshmen in chemistry, and cleaning office buildings on weekends. While my roommates went to parties and built friendships, I was constantly working, determined to prove I could succeed without his help. Everything changed when Linda Morrison entered our lives during my sophomore year. She was a 42-year-old real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair, a practiced smile, and an uncanny ability to make my father laugh again. At first, I felt relieved. Finally, someone who could bring joy back into his life. Linda showered him with attention, cooked his favorite meals, and seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. She would call me at college, suggesting care packages to send him or asking about his favorite restaurants for date nights. "I just want to make your father happy," she would say sweetly. "He's been through so much pain." When they announced their engagement after dating for only 8 months, I flew home immediately to celebrate with them. Linda greeted me at the airport with tears in her eyes, pulling me into what seemed like a genuine hug. "I'm so excited to have a daughter," she whispered. "I've always wanted that special bond." My father actually smiled as he watched us embrace, and for the first time in years, I felt hope that we might become a real family again. The wedding was small but beautiful, held in the backyard where my mother had once grown her prized rose garden. As I watched my father slip the ring onto Linda's finger, I made a silent promise to my mother's memory that I would support this new beginning. But subtle changes began almost immediately after the honeymoon. Linda would make little comments about my table manners when I visited for holidays. "Oh sweetie, in our family we don't talk with our mouths full," she'd say with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd rearrange the family photos on the mantel, gradually moving pictures of my mother to less prominent positions while adding more photos of herself and my father. When I mentioned it, she looked genuinely confused. "I thought you'd want the painful reminders put away," she said softly. "I'm just trying to help everyone heal." After graduating with honors from Northwestern with a degree in social work, I moved back home temporarily while searching for jobs in Chicago. I expected some resistance, but I hoped my father might finally see that I'd become a capable, educated adult. Instead, I was treated like an unwelcome houseguest in my own childhood home. Linda had redecorated my bedroom, turning it into her craft room, so I slept on an air mattress in the basement. It's just temporary until you get on your feet, my father explained, not meeting my eyes. Linda needs space for her projects. The basement was damp and cold, smelling of mildew and old paint cans. Each night as I tried to fall asleep on that uncomfortable mattress, I could hear Linda's laughter echoing through the ceiling as she and my father watched television in what used to be our family room. My 28th birthday was approaching in late October, and I became obsessed with the idea of creating the perfect celebration that might finally bridge the gap between my father and me. I secretly spent weeks researching his childhood, calling his elderly sister in Denver to ask about his favorite meals growing up. Aunt Dorothy was delighted to share stories about their mother's famous pot roast recipe, complete with the specific blend of herbs and vegetables their grandmother had brought from Ireland. "Your father used to beg our mother to make that roast for every special occasion," Dorothy laughed over the phone. "He'd eat 3 helpings and still ask for more." I drove to 3 different grocery stores to find the exact cuts of meat and imported Irish butter the recipe required. The ingredients cost nearly $200, representing almost my entire paycheck from my part-time job waiting tables at the local diner. But I didn't care about the expense if it meant creating something that would remind my father of happier times, maybe even bring back some warmth between us. I bought the finest wine I could afford, fresh flowers for centerpieces, and specialty candles that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, just like our house used to smell when my mother was alive. Linda initially seemed enthusiastic about helping with the preparations. "What a wonderful idea, sweetheart," she said when I told her about my plans. "Your father deserves something special. Let me help you with the shopping and cooking." But her assistance proved more hindrance than help. I'd carefully organize my ingredients in the refrigerator, only to find them mysteriously moved or missing the next day. When I asked Linda if she'd seen my imported herbs, she'd look genuinely puzzled. "I haven't touched anything in that fridge," she'd say with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you sure you brought them home?" I'd find the herbs 3 days later, hidden behind old leftovers in a completely different section of the refrigerator, by which time they'd started to wilt. Tyler, Linda's 15-year-old son from her previous marriage, seemed to take pleasure in undermining my efforts. He was a lanky teenager with perpetually messy brown hair and a smirk that reminded me of a calculating adult rather than a typical adolescent. When I borrowed china serving dishes from our elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson, Tyler somehow managed to, accidentally, knock the gravy boat off the counter while reaching for a snack. The antique piece shattered into dozens of fragments on the kitchen floor. "Oops," he said with a shrug, not bothering to help clean up the mess. "Guess you should have been more careful where you put it." I spent my lunch break the next day driving to antique shops, trying to find a replacement that Mrs. Patterson wouldn't notice. The closest match cost me $45 I couldn't really afford. The complaints about my cooking preparation started immediately. My father grumbled about the mess I was creating in his kitchen, even though I cleaned meticulously after every cooking session. "This house isn't a restaurant," he'd say irritably when he found me marinating the roast overnight. "Some of us have to get up early for real jobs." Linda would nod sympathetically, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Poor Richard, you work so hard all day, and then you come home to chaos," she'd coo. "Maybe we should just order pizza for the birthday instead." The suggestion felt like a knife to my heart. This wasn't just about food. It was about proving that I could create something meaningful, something that honored our family's history. As my birthday approached, I worked even harder to perfect every detail. I practiced the pot roast recipe twice, taking notes on timing and seasoning adjustments. I polished every piece of silverware until it gleamed, ironed my grandmother's lace tablecloth, and arranged flowers from the garden into elegant bouquets. 3 days before the celebration, I began the elaborate process of baking a 3-layer chocolate cake from scratch, using my mother's handwritten recipe that I'd found in an old cookbook. The recipe card was stained with vanilla extract and cocoa powder, evidence of all the birthday cakes she'd lovingly created over the years. On the morning of my birthday, I woke before dawn to begin the final preparations. I wanted everything to be perfect when my father came downstairs for breakfast. But Linda appeared in the kitchen at 7 a.m. with devastating news. "Oh honey, I hope you don't mind, but I invited my sister's family for dinner tonight," she announced casually while pouring herself coffee. It was such short notice, but they happened to be in town, and I thought the more the merrier. My carefully calculated portions for 3 people would now need to stretch for 8. I looked at the single roast in the refrigerator, the precisely measured vegetables, and felt panic rising in my chest. "I wish you'd asked me first," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I planned everything for a smaller group." Linda's expression shifted to one of hurt surprise. "I thought you'd be thrilled to have more family around," she said, her voice taking on a wounded tone. "I was just trying to make your birthday more festive. But if you want me to uninvite my own sister." She let the sentence hang in the air, making me feel like a selfish monster for even questioning her decision. I spent the rest of the morning frantically shopping for additional ingredients, using my emergency credit card to buy another roast, more vegetables, and wine for the unexpected guests. Linda's sister Barbara arrived at 5:30 with her husband Greg and their twin 8-year-old boys, Cameron and Connor. From the moment they walked through the door, they treated me like hired help rather than the daughter of the house celebrating her birthday. "Could you grab our coats?" Barbara asked without introduction, thrusting her designer jacket at me before even saying hello. "And the boys will need some snacks while we wait for dinner. Nothing too sugary though, they're already hyper from the car ride." I hung their coats in the hall closet while Linda introduced them to my father as if I weren't standing right there. Greg immediately launched into a detailed story about his latest golf game, monopolizing my father's attention completely. The twin boys ran through the house like tiny tornadoes, knocking over carefully arranged decorations and leaving muddy footprints on the carpet I'd vacuumed that morning. When I gently asked them to please be more careful around the breakable items, Barbara shot me a sharp look. "They're just children being children," she said defensively. "Maybe if this house had some appropriate toys instead of all these fancy decorations, they'd have something better to do." As I served the dinner I'd spent all day preparing, Linda graciously accepted compliments from her family about the wonderful meal she'd helped create. "Linda's always been such an amazing cook," Barbara gushed, cutting into her perfectly seasoned pot roast. "Remember when we were kids, and you used to make those incredible Sunday dinners for the whole family?" Linda beamed under the praise, never once mentioning that I'd spent weeks researching the recipes or that she'd barely lifted a finger to help with the actual cooking. My father nodded approvingly as he ate, but his praise was directed entirely toward Linda. "I'm lucky to have someone who takes such good care of me," he said warmly, squeezing her hand across the table. The situation grew more painful when my college friends Jessica and Maria arrived at 7:30 with beautifully wrapped birthday gifts. I'd invited them weeks earlier, before I knew about Linda's last-minute additions to the guest list. They looked around the crowded dining room with confusion, clearly not expecting such a formal family gathering. "We don't want to intrude," Jessica said hesitantly, holding a bottle of champagne she'd brought to celebrate. "We can come back another time when it's more convenient." But I desperately needed their friendly faces and genuine affection after hours of being ignored by my own family. My father's demeanor changed instantly when he saw my friends. His jaw tightened, and his eyes grew cold in a way that I hadn't seen since my teenage years. "I wasn't aware we were having additional guests," he said icily, not bothering to stand or welcome them into his home. "This is supposed to be a family dinner." Linda placed a concerned hand on his arm, whispering something in his ear that made his frown deepen even further. The tension in the room became suffocating as everyone stared at my friends, who stood awkwardly in the doorway still holding their gifts. "They were invited," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice level despite the humiliation burning in my cheeks. "I told you about this last week." But my father shook his head dismissively. "I don't recall any such conversation," he said coldly. "And frankly, we don't have room for extra people who weren't part of the original plan." The lie was so blatant and cruel that I felt physically sick. I had definitely told him about inviting my friends, and Linda had been standing right there when we discussed it. Jessica and Maria exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly wanting to escape the hostile atmosphere. "Maybe we should go," Maria said quietly, already backing toward the front door. "Happy birthday, Natalie. We'll call you tomorrow." They left quickly, taking their gifts and bottle of champagne with them, leaving me feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The rest of Linda's family watched the entire exchange with barely concealed curiosity, as if they were witnessing an entertaining drama rather than a daughter being publicly humiliated by her own father on her birthday. When it came time for the birthday cake presentation, I carried my masterpiece into the dining room with trembling hands. The 3-layer chocolate creation had taken me 6 hours to bake and decorate, with hand-piped roses made from buttercream frosting and delicate silver pearls around each tier. I'd used my mother's recipe and technique, hoping to recreate some of the magic from childhood birthdays when she would present elaborate cakes that looked like works of art. "Happy birthday to me," I said softly, setting the cake in the center of the table and waiting for anyone, to acknowledge the effort I'd put into creating something beautiful. My father examined the cake with the critical eye of a professional food critic, pointing out every minor flaw in the frosting work. "The layers are uneven," he announced to the table. "And this piping work looks pretty amateur. Your mother could do much better than this when you were little." His words hit me like physical blows, each criticism designed to maximize the pain. Linda nodded sympathetically, as if she were genuinely concerned about my poor baking skills. "It's a sweet effort, honey," she said in a patronizing tone. "Maybe next time you could take a decorating class or something." That's when my father's carefully controlled facade finally cracked completely. He stood up abruptly, his face flushed with what appeared to be years of pent-up rage. "This entire evening is pathetic," he declared loudly enough for the entire table to hear. "This desperate attention-seeking behavior, this need to be the center of everyone's universe. It's embarrassing." Before I could process what was happening, he grabbed my beautiful cake with both hands and hurled it across the kitchen with all his strength. The cake exploded against the far wall, sending chocolate frosting and cake fragments flying in every direction. The room fell into stunned silence as pieces of my destroyed creation slid slowly down the wallpaper onto the floor. Linda immediately rushed to comfort my father, wrapping her arms around him as if he were the victim in this situation. "You're absolutely right, Richard," she said soothingly while I stood frozen in shock, chocolate frosting dripping from my hair onto my birthday dress. "Natalie has always been selfish and ungrateful. After everything you've done for her, this is how she repays you." Barbara and Greg gathered their children quickly, muttering awkward goodbyes as they escaped the toxic atmosphere. Tyler smirked from the corner where he'd been watching the entire drama unfold, clearly entertained by my humiliation and pain. After everyone left, I found myself alone in the kitchen, mechanically cleaning chocolate frosting off the walls while my father and Linda retreated to their bedroom upstairs. The silence in the house felt deafening after the chaos of the evening. As I scrubbed cake fragments from the baseboards, tears streaming down my face, I kept replaying every moment of the disaster, trying to understand how my carefully planned celebration had gone so horribly wrong. The room still smelled like vanilla and chocolate, a cruel reminder of the joy and hope I'd invested in creating something beautiful that had been destroyed in seconds. While reaching behind the decorative plant in the corner to clean frosting that had splattered there, my fingers brushed against something small and hard attached to the wall. I pulled the plant aside and discovered a tiny camera, no bigger than a button, tucked behind the leaves with a clear view of the entire kitchen. My heart started racing as I traced the nearly invisible wire that led from the camera along the baseboard toward my father's home office. I'd lived in this house for most of my life, but I'd never noticed this camera before. When had it been installed, and more importantly, why was my father secretly recording the kitchen? The next morning, while my father was at work and Linda had taken Tyler shopping for school clothes, I decided to investigate further. I followed the wires from the kitchen camera through the basement and up into my father's office, a room that had been strictly off-limits since my childhood. The door was usually locked, but Linda had left it slightly ajar in her haste to leave the house. Inside, I discovered a sophisticated computer setup with multiple monitors and a complex hard drive system that looked far more advanced than anything my father would need for his accounting work. The main computer was password protected, but I knew my father well enough to guess that he'd use something sentimental and easy to remember. After trying several combinations related to his birthday and social security number, I typed in my mother's maiden name followed by their wedding anniversary. The screen unlocked immediately, revealing a desktop filled with folders labeled by date and location throughout the house. There were cameras everywhere. The kitchen, living room, dining room, my basement bedroom, even the bathrooms. I felt sick realizing that my father had been watching and recording every private moment of my life since returning home from college. I clicked on the folder labeled Kitchen October and found weeks of recorded footage. The files were organized by date, with the most recent recordings at the top of the list. I started with the footage from my birthday preparation week, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. There, in crystal clear high definition, was video evidence of Linda deliberately sabotaging my efforts. I watched in horror as she moved my carefully organized ingredients to different locations in the refrigerator, not accidentally but with clear intentional malice. She would check to make sure no one was watching before hiding my herbs behind old containers or moving my imported butter to the back of the freezer where it would be nearly impossible to find. The footage showed Tyler's accident with Mrs. Patterson's gravy boat in shocking detail. It wasn't an accident at all. Linda had specifically instructed him to break something important to me, coaching him on how to make it look unintentional. Just bump into the counter really hard when she's not looking, Linda's voice came through clearly on the audio. Make sure you break something she'll have to replace. I want her stressed and scrambling right before her precious birthday party. Tyler had laughed and high-fived his mother after successfully destroying the antique serving piece. They celebrated my pain like it was some kind of victory. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. I found a folder labeled Private Conversations that contained hours of recorded discussions between Linda and my father when they thought they were alone. The first video I clicked on showed them sitting in the living room late at night, speaking in hushed tones about their plans for my future. She looks exactly like her mother, my father said bitterly, staring at a photo on the mantel. Same eyes, same stubborn expression. Every time I see her face, I'm reminded of everything I lost. Linda moved closer to him on the couch, her voice taking on a sympathetic but calculating tone. I understand completely, darling. It must be so painful having that constant reminder of your grief living in your house. I just want her gone, my father continued, his voice filled with a venom I'd never heard before. I've tried to be patient, but having her here is like keeping an open wound that never heals. She's supposed to be independent by now, not still depending on us for everything. Linda nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased with his admission. Maybe we need to make her living situation more uncomfortable, she suggested with false concern. Sometimes people need a little push to motivate them to move on with their lives. I hate to say it, but maybe being too accommodating isn't helping her grow up. The conversation continued with Linda systematically encouraging my father's resentment and hostility toward me. She suggested ways to make my life more difficult, from charging me rent I couldn't afford to creating household rules designed to make me feel unwelcome. The sooner she realizes she doesn't belong here, the sooner she'll find her own place and stop being such a burden on your emotional well-being, Linda concluded, stroking my father's hand with false sympathy. You've suffered enough, Richard. You deserve peace in your own home. As I dug deeper into the recorded files, I uncovered evidence of a conspiracy far more sinister than simple family manipulation. Hidden in a folder labeled Financial Planning were dozens of videos showing Linda systematically going through my father's personal documents when he was at work. I watched in growing horror as she photographed bank statements, insurance policies, his will, and even my mother's trust fund documents that were supposed to be securely stored in his bedroom safe. Linda had somehow discovered the safe's combination and was regularly accessing confidential financial information without my father's knowledge. The recordings revealed Linda's methodical approach to understanding and ultimately controlling my father's entire financial situation. She spent hours on phone calls with various lawyers, asking detailed questions about inheritance law, estate planning, and the process of contesting existing wills. Hypothetically speaking, she would say to each attorney, if someone wanted to challenge a deceased spouse's trust fund, what would be the strongest legal arguments? She took careful notes during these conversations, building a comprehensive understanding of how to manipulate the legal system to her advantage. One particularly damning video showed Linda researching my mother's trust fund, which had been established specifically for my education and future security. The trust contained nearly $200,000 that was legally mine when I turned 30, but Linda was exploring ways to contest its validity. She'd printed out dozens of legal documents and was highlighting sections about trust fund disputes, mental incompetency claims, and spousal inheritance rights. "If Richard is declared unable to manage his own affairs," she muttered to herself while reading, "then as his wife, I could potentially challenge any previous financial arrangements made by his deceased wife." The most chilling discovery was a series of bank statements showing mysterious large withdrawals from my father's accounts that coincided perfectly with Linda's expensive shopping trips and luxury purchases. She'd been systematically stealing from his savings for months, but she was clever about it, never taking huge amounts at once. Instead, she withdrew $300 or $400 every few days, always with a different excuse. The recorded conversations revealed her justifications. She was investing in household improvements, buying groceries for the family, or handling unexpected medical expenses that never seemed to actually exist. My investigation led me to search for information about Linda's previous marriage, and what I found made my skin crawl. Her first husband, Harold Morrison, had died just 3 years earlier under circumstances that seemed suspiciously similar to her current situation with my father. Harold had been a wealthy 72-year-old retired businessman who'd married Linda after a whirlwind romance of less than 6 months. According to the police reports I found online, Harold had died of apparent heart failure, but the investigation notes mentioned family members' concerns about his rapid deterioration and Linda's eagerness to claim his inheritance. The police file contained testimonies from Harold's adult children, who described their father's mysterious personality changes after marrying Linda. They claimed he became isolated from his longtime friends, stopped participating in activities he'd enjoyed for decades, and seemed confused and disoriented in his final months. Most disturbing was their allegation that Linda had prevented them from visiting their father during his last illness, claiming he was too tired for company and needed complete rest. Harold's children had tried to contest his will, which left everything to Linda, but they lacked sufficient evidence to prove any wrongdoing. The investigation had been dropped when the medical examiner ruled Harold's death as natural causes, but the file contained notes about unexplained substances found in his system that could potentially cause heart problems if administered over time. Linda had inherited nearly $800,000 from Harold's estate, money that she'd apparently spent within 2 years before setting her sights on my father. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear. Linda was a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable older men with substantial assets, manipulated them into marriage, and then systematically destroyed them financially and potentially physically. Reading through Harold's children's statements, I recognized the same tactics Linda was using on my father and me. She'd isolated Harold from his support system, encouraged his resentment toward his children, and gradually taken control of his finances while presenting herself as his devoted caretaker. The medical records showed Harold's health declining rapidly after Linda began preparing his meals, with symptoms that included memory loss, confusion, and cardiac irregularities that his previous medical history couldn't explain. I found a folder on Linda's personal laptop labeled Research Projects that contained extensive information about untraceable poisons, drug interactions that could cause heart failure, and methods of inducing memory loss and cognitive decline. She'd been studying how to slowly poison someone over months without detection, focusing specifically on substances that would mimic natural aging or stress-related health problems. The research was so detailed and comprehensive that it couldn't possibly be accidental or casual browsing. Most terrifying of all was a recent email exchange between Linda and someone named Marcus who signed his messages only with the initial M. The messages were deliberately vague but clearly discussed handling problems and making arrangements for difficult family situations. Marcus seemed to be some kind of enforcer or criminal associate who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. "The Natalie issue needs to be resolved soon," Linda had written in her most recent message. "She's becoming too suspicious and could potentially interfere with our timeline. Can you recommend the most efficient approach for this type of situation?" Realizing the mortal danger I was in, I knew I couldn't handle this situation alone or through normal family channels. I needed professional help from someone with law enforcement experience who would take my concerns seriously. I remembered my mother's best friend Catherine Williams, who had been a detective with the Chicago Police Department for 25 years before retiring to Arizona. My mother and Catherine had maintained their friendship since college, and Catherine had always told me to call if I ever needed anything, no matter how much time had passed. Catherine answered her phone on the second ring, and her warm, familiar voice brought tears to my eyes. "Natalie, sweetheart, what a wonderful surprise," she said genuinely. "I was just thinking about you and your mother the other day. How are things going?" When I explained that I needed her professional advice about a serious family situation, her tone immediately became focused and alert. "Tell me everything," she said simply. "Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." I spent 2 hours on the phone with Catherine, describing everything I discovered about Linda's criminal activities and the danger I believed my father and I were facing. Catherine listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details or timelines. When I finished my story, there was a long pause before Catherine spoke again. "Natalie, what you're describing sounds like a classic pattern of elder abuse and potential homicide," she said grimly. "This woman is extremely dangerous, and you're right to be scared. But the evidence you've gathered could be exactly what law enforcement needs to stop her before she kills your father." Catherine explained that she still maintained close relationships with active detectives in several major police departments, including specialists who handled financial crimes and elder abuse cases. "There's a detective in your area named Sarah Wilson who's made a career out of prosecuting these kinds of predators," Catherine told me. "She's brilliant, thorough, and she doesn't give up until justice is served. I'm going to call her immediately and arrange for you to meet. But Natalie, you need to be extremely careful until we can get law enforcement involved officially. Don't let Linda know that you suspect anything." Detective Wilson agreed to meet me the next day at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that made me feel immediately safer. "Catherine filled me in on the basics," she said after introducing herself. "But I need to see the evidence you've collected before I can determine our next steps." I showed her the video files I'd copied to external hard drives, the financial records documenting Linda's theft, and the research materials about poisoning and inheritance fraud. Detective Wilson spent nearly an hour reviewing the evidence, her expression growing more serious with each video clip and document. "This is incredibly thorough documentation," she said finally. "You've essentially built half of our case for us. But we need to gather additional evidence of ongoing crimes to make arrests that will stick in court. The historical material from her previous marriage is compelling, but we need proof of current criminal activity that we can prosecute immediately." Together, we developed a plan for me to safely gather additional evidence while Detective Wilson coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to build a comprehensive case. She provided me with small, sophisticated recording devices that I could hide throughout the house to capture Linda's incriminating conversations and activities. "The key is to let her think her plan is working perfectly," Detective Wilson explained. "Predators like Linda become careless and overconfident when they believe they're in complete control. We're going to use that arrogance against her." Over the following week, I secretly installed the new recording devices while maintaining my facade of being the defeated, broken daughter that Linda believed me to be. I captured hours of additional footage showing Linda continuing to steal money from my father's accounts, coaching Tyler to lie about my behavior, and making increasingly explicit plans for eliminating me as an obstacle to her inheritance scheme. The most damning evidence came when I recorded Linda's phone conversations with Marcus, where they discussed permanent solutions to family interference problems. Detective Wilson also arranged for my father's food to be secretly tested for toxins and unusual substances. The results confirmed our worst fears. He was being systematically poisoned with small amounts of digitalis, a heart medication that can cause cardiac arrest when administered to someone who doesn't need it. The poisoning explained his recent memory problems, fatigue, and occasional chest pains that Linda had been dismissing as normal signs of aging and work stress. "She's been slowly killing him for months," Detective Wilson said grimly when the test results came back. "If we hadn't intervened, he probably would have died within the next few weeks, and it would have looked completely natural." The investigation expanded when Detective Wilson connected with law enforcement agencies in Harold Morrison's hometown. They reopened his case based on the new evidence we'd uncovered, and his body was exhumed for additional toxicology testing. The results showed the same digitalis poisoning that Linda was using on my father, finally providing the proof needed to charge her with Harold's murder. She's killed before, and she was absolutely planning to kill again, Detective Wilson told me during one of our secret meetings. You've potentially saved not only your father's life but the lives of future victims she would have targeted after finishing with your family. With solid evidence of Linda's criminal activities and a coordinated law enforcement response in place, Detective Wilson and I developed an elaborate sting operation designed to catch Linda in the act of attempting murder. The plan required me to convince Linda that I was giving up completely and leaving town permanently, which would hopefully prompt her to accelerate her timeline for eliminating both me and my father. Predators like Linda hate loose ends, Detective Wilson explained. If she thinks you're running away defeated, she might become careless enough to reveal her complete plan on camera. I spent several days preparing for my performance, practicing the role of a broken, defeated daughter who had finally realized she wasn't wanted in her own family. The hardest part was maintaining this facade around my father, who was still unaware of the danger he was in or the elaborate investigation happening around him. Detective Wilson had insisted that we couldn't tell him about Linda's crimes until we had her safely in custody, since his reaction might alert her that something had changed. Watching him grow weaker and more confused each day from the ongoing poisoning was almost unbearable, but I had to trust that we were close to ending his suffering. On a Tuesday morning, I announced to Linda and my father over breakfast that I'd decided to move to Seattle immediately. I found a job opportunity out there, I said listlessly, not meeting anyone's eyes. It's clear that I'm not welcome here, so I think it's best if I just start over somewhere completely new. Linda's eyes lit up with barely concealed triumph, but she quickly arranged her features into an expression of concerned sympathy. "Oh sweetie, are you sure that's what you want?" she asked with false sincerity. Moving so far away from family seems like such a drastic decision. My father's reaction was exactly what Linda had hoped for. Instead of showing any sadness or regret about my departure, he nodded approvingly. "It's probably for the best," he said coldly. "You're 28 years old, Natalie. It's past time you started taking responsibility for your own life instead of depending on other people to take care of you." The word stung, but I reminded myself that his hostility was largely the result of Linda's manipulation and the cognitive effects of being poisoned. The real Richard Brooks, the father who had loved me before grief and Linda's influence changed him, would never have spoken to me with such cruelty. Over the next few days, I made a great show of packing my belongings and making arrangements for my fictional move to Seattle. Linda was incredibly helpful during this process, constantly offering to assist with organizing my things or researching moving companies. Her eagerness to see me gone was so obvious that I wondered how I'd ever missed the signs of her true nature. She peppered me with questions about my exact departure date, my new address, and whether I planned to maintain any contact with my father once I was settled in my new life. The hidden cameras captured Linda's true celebration once she believed my departure was imminent. When my father was at work, she danced around the kitchen, called her sister to share the wonderful news that the selfish stepdaughter was finally leaving, and began making elaborate plans for redecorating the house once I was gone. "I can finally turn that basement room into the home Jim Richard and I have always wanted," she told Barbara over the phone. "And without Natalie here constantly causing drama, Richard and I can focus on our future together." But Linda's most revealing conversation was with Tyler, who had become increasingly uncomfortable with his mother's criminal activities as they escalated beyond simple theft and manipulation. The cameras caught Linda coaching Tyler about what to tell police if anyone ever asked questions about my disappearance. "If anyone wants to know about Natalie, you just say she was always unstable and prone to making impulsive decisions," Linda instructed him. "You can mention that she seemed depressed and talked about wanting to disappear completely. Make sure you sound concerned but not surprised that she'd vanish without warning." Tyler's response shocked both Linda and me. "Mom, what are you really planning to do to Natalie?" he asked with genuine fear in his voice. "This doesn't sound like you're just waiting for her to move away. Are you going to hurt her?" Linda's mask slipped completely as she grabbed Tyler's shoulders and stared into his eyes with cold intensity. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed. "Natalie is a problem that needs to be solved permanently. If you can't handle helping me with this family business, then maybe you need to go live with your father permanently." The threat against her own son revealed just how far Linda was willing to go to protect her criminal enterprise. Tyler began crying, admitting that he'd never wanted to hurt me and that he'd only participated in Linda's schemes because he was afraid of what she might do to him if he refused. "She made me break that lady's dish," he confessed through his tears. "She said if I didn't help her make Natalie miserable, she'd tell Dad that I was the one stealing money from his wallet. I never wanted any of this to happen." Detective Wilson decided that Tyler's emotional breakdown represented our best opportunity to capture Linda making explicit threats and admissions of guilt. She had me announce that my departure had been delayed by a few days due to paperwork issues with my new job, which sent Linda into a barely controlled rage. The cameras captured her furious phone call with Marcus, where she abandoned all pretense of speaking in code. "The situation has become critical," she told him bluntly. "The girl needs to disappear permanently before she leaves town, and it needs to look like an accident or suicide. Can your people handle that kind of arrangement?" Marcus's response was equally direct and chilling. "We can make it look like she had a breakdown about the family situation and decided to end things herself," he said matter-of-factly. "Lots of young people struggle with depression and make tragic decisions. Very sad, but these things happen. The timeline would need to be immediate though. Tonight or tomorrow at the latest." Linda agreed to the plan without hesitation, arranging to meet Marcus that evening to finalize the details of my murder. Detective Wilson coordinated with a full SWAT team to monitor Linda's meeting with Marcus and to be ready for immediate intervention when they attempted to carry out their murder plot. I spent what I knew would be my last day in the house wearing a wire and trying to act normally while Linda finalized her plans to have me killed. The surreal nature of making small talk with someone who was actively planning my murder was almost more than my mind could process, but I focused on the knowledge that by tomorrow, my father would finally be safe from the woman who'd been systematically destroying his life. Linda left the house that evening under the pretense of meeting a girlfriend for dinner, but the surveillance team followed her to an abandoned warehouse where Marcus was waiting with 2 other men. Detective Wilson's team recorded the entire conversation where Linda paid Marcus $5,000 in cash to eliminate the stepdaughter problem and to make it look convincing for the insurance investigation. The level of casual cruelty in Linda's voice as she described how my death should be staged was something that would haunt me for years to come. The plan was for Marcus and his associates to break into the house late that night, kill me in a way that would appear to be suicide by overdose, and arrange the scene to suggest that I'd been struggling with depression and family conflicts. Linda had provided them with detailed information about my daily routines, the location of my bedroom, and even suggestions for a suicide note that would explain my decision to end my life rather than face the disappointment of being rejected by my family. She'd thought through every detail with the same meticulous planning she'd used for Harold Morrison's murder. But as Linda returned home from her meeting, she discovered something that sent her into a panic. The hidden recording devices I'd planted throughout the house. In her excitement about finalizing my murder, she'd become careless about checking for surveillance equipment. When she found the first camera, her immediate reaction was pure rage and fear. She began frantically searching the house, finding device after device, realizing that months of incriminating evidence had been captured on video. Linda's discovery of the cameras coincided with my father's early return from a business dinner. As she stood in the kitchen surrounded by the recording devices she'd torn from their hiding places, screaming about invasion of privacy and family betrayal, my father walked through the front door and witnessed his wife's complete mental breakdown. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, taking in the scene of Linda standing amid the scattered electronics, her carefully maintained facade completely shattered. I seized the opportunity to tell my father everything while Linda was too panicked to maintain her innocent act. "Dad, she's been poisoning you," I said urgently, pulling out copies of the medical test results Detective Wilson had obtained. "She killed her first husband the same way, and she was planning to kill you once she'd gotten rid of me permanently. The police have been investigating her for weeks." My father's confused expression shifted to horror as he began to piece together the implications of what I was telling him. Linda's response was to grab the largest kitchen knife from the butcher block and point it directly at me. "You stupid little bitch," she snarled, her voice transformed into something barely human. "You've ruined everything. Do you have any idea how long I've been planning this? How much money was involved?" Her confession to planning my father's murder came pouring out in a stream of rage-fueled admissions. He was supposed to die quietly in his sleep next week, and everyone would have felt sorry for poor Linda, who lost 2 husbands to heart problems. But you couldn't just disappear quietly like you were supposed to. The kitchen became a terrifying battleground as Linda advanced toward me with the knife, screaming about the millions of dollars I'd cost her by interfering with her inheritance plans. My father, still weak from months of poisoning, tried to intervene but stumbled and fell against the kitchen island. Linda's complete psychological break was captured on the remaining hidden cameras as she revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise, including plans to kill my father that very weekend and claim his life insurance before anyone could discover the ongoing theft from his accounts. Detective Wilson and her team burst through the front door just as Linda raised the knife above her head, preparing to stab me. Police. Drop the weapon. The tactical team had been monitoring our location and rushed in the moment they realized Linda had discovered the surveillance equipment and was likely to become violent. Linda's last act of defiance was to scream about being framed and victimized, claiming that I had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to make her look like a criminal because I was jealous of her relationship with my father. The arrest was swift and efficient, with Linda being handcuffed and read her rights while paramedics rushed my father to the hospital for immediate treatment to counter the effects of the digitalis poisoning. Tyler, who had been hiding upstairs during the confrontation, finally felt safe enough to come forward with his own testimony about his mother's crimes. His willingness to testify against Linda provided crucial corroborating evidence that would ensure her conviction for multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, financial fraud, and elder abuse. 6 months after Linda's arrest, I stood in a courtroom watching the judge sentence her to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Harold Morrison and the attempted murder of my father and me. The additional charges of financial fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder added decades to her sentence, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable families. During the sentencing hearing, Linda maintained her innocence and blamed me for destroying her loving marriage to my father, refusing to acknowledge the extensive evidence of her crimes even when faced with overwhelming proof. The investigation into Linda's criminal activities expanded far beyond our family when detectives discovered evidence linking her to at least 3 other suspicious deaths of elderly men she'd been involved with over the past decade. Marcus and his associates pled guilty to conspiracy charges and provided testimony that helped prosecutors understand the full scope of Linda's murderous enterprise. The case made national headlines as an example of the sophisticated methods modern predators use to target and exploit elderly victims, leading to new legislation designed to protect vulnerable adults from financial and physical abuse. My father's recovery from the digitalis poisoning was slow but complete, and the process of rebuilding our relationship became one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. As the toxic effects of the poison cleared from his system and he began attending therapy to address his unresolved grief over my mother's death, he gradually transformed back into the loving father I remembered from my childhood. The first time he genuinely smiled at me and said he was proud of the courage I'd shown in saving his life, I cried tears of joy and relief that I'd thought I'd never experience again. "I'm so sorry, Natalie," he said during one of our weekly therapy sessions together. "I let my grief over losing your mother turn me into someone I never wanted to be. You look so much like her that seeing you every day was like keeping a wound open, but instead of dealing with my pain properly, I took it out on you. That was cruel and unfair, and you deserved so much better from me." His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and commit to rebuilding our relationship gave me hope that we could create something even stronger than what we'd lost. Tyler, who was now 16 and had testified courageously against his mother despite the personal cost, chose to maintain contact with me and my father after being placed in foster care with a loving family. The trauma of discovering his mother's true nature and participating in her crimes had been devastating for him, but with intensive therapy and support, he began to heal and take responsibility for his actions. "I know I can't undo the things I did to hurt you," he told me during one of his visits. "But I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be better than the person my mother taught me to be." With the house holding too many painful memories, my father decided to sell it and move to a smaller, more manageable home across town. The process of packing up decades of family history was emotional but ultimately healing, as we worked together to preserve the memories of my mother while leaving behind the toxic associations with Linda's presence. My father insisted that I keep all of my mother's jewelry, recipes, and personal items, acknowledging that I was the rightful guardian of her legacy. I used a portion of my mother's trust fund, which was finally released to me after the legal complications were resolved, to establish the Elizabeth Brooks Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention, named in honor of my mother. The foundation provides education, resources, and support for families dealing with suspected elder abuse, financial exploitation, and domestic predators. Working with Detective Wilson, who became the foundation's law enforcement liaison, we've helped dozens of families identify and escape from dangerous situations similar to what my father and I experienced. The foundation's work introduced me to James Mitchell, a social worker who specialized in family trauma recovery and had survived his own experience with a predatory stepparent as a teenager. Our shared understanding of family betrayal and the healing process created a natural foundation for friendship that gradually developed into something deeper. James brought patience, kindness, and genuine understanding to our relationship, never rushing me to move faster than I was comfortable with as I learned to trust and love again. When I turned 29, exactly 1 year after the birthday disaster that had started this entire nightmare, my father insisted on hosting a proper celebration. This time, there were no ulterior motives, no hidden agendas, no family members plotting against each other. Just my father, James, Tyler, Detective Wilson and her family, and Catherine, who flew in from Arizona to share in our healing and happiness. My father presented me with a 3-layer chocolate cake he'd baked himself using my mother's recipe, complete with hand-piped roses and a heartfelt apology written in elegant script across the top layer. "To my beautiful daughter," he said with tears in his eyes, "who had the courage to save our family when I was too broken to save myself. Your mother would be so proud of the amazing woman you've become." As we shared the cake that represented not just my birthday but our family's resurrection from nearly fatal betrayal, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of genuine peace and love. The experience taught me that sometimes the family we rebuild is stronger than the family we started with, forged by conscious choice rather than simple biology. Trauma and betrayal don't have to define our stories if we're willing to do the hard work of healing and forgiveness. My father and I chose to fight for our relationship instead of letting Linda's poison destroy us permanently, and that choice made all the difference between remaining victims and becoming survivors. Looking around the table at my father's genuine smile, Tyler's hopeful laughter, James's steady presence, and the friends who'd supported us through the darkest period of our lives, I felt gratitude for the painful journey that had led us to this place of authentic connection and mutual respect. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need, and what I needed was a family built on truth, respect, and unconditional love rather than obligation, manipulation, and fear. The security cameras that had initially captured my humiliation and pain ultimately became the tools of our liberation and Linda's downfall, proving that even in our darkest moments, the truth has a way of emerging when we're brave enough to seek it out and strong enough to act on what we discover. Have you ever found yourself in a toxic family situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? How did you find the courage to speak up when the people who were supposed to love you were the ones causing the most harm? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if this story resonated with you. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell for more true stories about family drama, healing, and finding strength in the most difficult circumstances. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles with difficult family members. Thank you for listening to my story and for all the love and support you've shown. Remember, no matter how dark things seem, there's always hope for healing and new beginnings. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.